Now, here we're talking about this topic of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. What's aggregate supply and what's aggregate demand? Let's see. What influences macro outcomes must be transmitted through supply and demand, and we start to look at the aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total quantities of output demanded at alternative prices levels in a given time period, such as purpose. Are you guys okay with the definition? Yeah. Basically the same demand. It's just that it is aggregate. It means for everything in the economy. Not just mangoes or potatoes. It's mangoes, potatoes, barbers, chicken makers, everything. And the real GDP, the output is the inflation adjusted value of a GDP, or the value of output in constant prices. So this is real GDP. Price level is what? It says the aggregate demand curve illustrates how volume of purchases varies with average prices. With a given constant level of income, people will buy more goods and services at lower prices. Are you guys okay with this idea? Now, to clarify this idea, just look at this graph. Now, on this graph, it shows you the aggregate demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve, it shows here the real output, which is GDP, quantity per year. And here, we've got this price level, which is the average prices. And here we have low prices and we have high prices. And this is the aggregate demand curve. Does it remind you of anything? No. Demand curve.
Almost the same.
Almost the same. Lower prices will encounter more spending. So if the general prices are low, people will buy more of all of the things. So same thing like the yes. Now on the other hand, we've got this aggregate demand curve. It slopes downward. And why does it slope downward? There are three reasons. Because of real balances effect, foreign trade effect, and interest rate effect. What are these effects? The real balances is when things are cheaper, people buy more. Makes sense? Yeah. When things are cheaper, people will spend more. And foreign trade, if things are cheaper, then we don't have to import from other countries. We can buy from local. And interest rates, if interest rates are low and it's cheap, then we can borrow money and buy more. You see, when interest rates are expensive, then we buy less and we don't buy more. We buy less. So this is like the same effect like the supply, similar to the demand, similar to the aggregate demand, just on an economy as a whole. What is real balances effect? The real value of money is measured by how many goods and services such each dollar will buy, and all prices fall. As prices fall, money can purchase more goods. That makes sense? The foreign, it says if domestic prices decline, consumers will demand more domestic output. And the third one is the interest rate effect. When lower prices levels, at lower price levels, interest rates will fall as consumers will borrow less. Right? So if prices are very cheap, people don't have to borrow as much. And lower interest rates will stimulate more borrowing. And if you do more borrowing, it means you do what? More loan purchases. Aggregate supply, on the other hand. Aggregate supply is the total quantities of output produced producers are willing and able to supply at alternative price levels in a given time period such as purpose. Does this remind you of anything? The supply curve. Very similar. It's just that for the whole economy, for everyone. Okay, from the tomatoes to the potatoes to the chicken farmers to the aggregate supply curve slopes. It looks like this. Do you see how it looks like? Very close to the supply curve. Aggregate supply curve, it is upward sloping. So this is upward sloping. We expect the rate of output to increase when the price levels rise. So if prices increase, people will be willing to supply more. Higher prices will encourage more production. Okay. And then we've got this profit margin. Now, producers' short-run costs, like rent and negotiated wages, are relatively constant. So higher product prices will tend to widen their profit margin, so producers will want to produce and sell more. right? Same idea for suppliers that we remember when we talked about supply, the babysitting of my baby. So here, if we take it for the whole economy, it's the same idea. And also remember, the same supply curve is like the same as the marginal cost curve. And it's the production costs, they tend to increase as producers try to produce more. So as you produce more units, then your cost starts to increase. And they must acquire more resources and use existing plant and equipment more intensively. And the aggregate supply curve is relatively flat when capacity is underutilized. So here at the beginning, it is very flat. Why? Because we're not using all of. Then if you use all of our capacity, then prices starts to increase. So at the beginning, it starts slow, and then it starts to increase quickly. So here is just basically explaining that beginning of the slope upward, producers approach capacity. So that's why it goes until infinity, supply curve. So the macro equilibrium, what's the macro equilibrium? Very similar to the equilibrium we saw in the previous chapters. That's when aggregate supply and demand curves, they summarize the market activities of the whole macro economy. And macro equilibrium, the unique combination of price levels and real output, there is a compatible with both aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So once they meet, here is the level prices and this is the output. Economy is in equilibrium as a whole. Do you think the Yemeni economy now is in equilibrium? Well, if you see, let's say, maybe oil prices, it is reaching an equilibrium. You know, this 4,300 is almost like the price. That is equilibrium. That's if you look at on an individual. Now, if you look at the overall prices level, did they reach some sort of an equilibrium? Or are they quickly changing? You see? So if you look at the dollar price, you know, in terms of all imported products of Yemen, you see it is like, you know, more or less it increases and decreases of 360, has been there for a while. Now here the macro level, the unique combination of prices, okay, here if the only price output combination mutually compatible with both buyers and sellers. So as long as buyers and sellers are in stable mode, they can buy and these people they sell, then we are almost in an equilibrium. And remember, the market will try to be in an equilibrium. Because if prices are more, then we will start to reach an equilibrium. Remember when we talked about in the previous chapters, when they negotiate trial and error until they reach equilibrium? Here it becomes very similar, but on a macro level. Here we have the macro equilibrium. This is quantity equilibrium, which is real output. And here prices equilibrium. Now, of course, this is like real. Remember, every time you see a real, it's adjusted for inflation. So this idea of inflation, you know, if you remove inflation, then it becomes like it's exactly the same prices. Now here, what happens if there is a macro disequilibrium? If prices level are higher at the equilibrium, buyers will want to buy less, and then producers will want to produce and sell more, right? On the other hand, if a disequilibrium situation, the intentions of buyers and sellers are incompatible. And if they are incompatible, what happens? We have a failure. And the two potential problems will macro equilibrium will be undesirable and unstable. So if we are in undesirable, then the price output relationship at equilibrium may not satisfy our macro goals. And if they're not, if they're unstable, that even the designated macroeconomy is optimal, may displace by macro disturbances. And the conclusion is we will get undesirable outcomes, such as, let's see, full unemployment, the rate of real output produced at full employment. Unemployment, the inability of labor to find jobs. Inflation, increase in the average prices. Are you guys okay with this? I went on it quickly. Let me summarize it brief. If we are not here, then let's say if we are here, remember surplus or maybe shortage. Now here, if we are in an equilibrium, you know, maybe here we will be in a full unemployment. So remember when we looked at supply and demand, we always want to be in equilibrium. That's the point where we want to be. If we're not there, suppliers will do something and consumers will do something. Either there is a shortage, and if there is a shortage, then we will try to crave for more and we will pay more. and or maybe there is a surplus, and if there is a surplus, then we will start to negotiate to get the price cheaper. Now, in a macro level, it's the same thing. It's just that we will start to look at inflation and employment, right? If prices are very expensive and wages are very high, then we will start to see people not buying. Remember flexible wages, the classic theorists? It's going to, you have to accept lower wage to push the prices to be less. You see? If this is like a shortage, then people will go, they want to produce more, and then they will go create jobs. More people will get jobs. As more people get jobs, prices start to increase until we reach the equilibrium. Are you guys okay with this? So here is, the idea is there will always be the market dynamics that's going to push towards equilibrium. Now, unemployment will rise when QE is less than QF. Let's say if we are in this position, if these are the prices. So if you try to put these prices, we will start to see more unemployment. So, try to, accept lower jobs. People start to work. They produce more. Prices starts to, until you reach this equilibrium point. Are you guys okay with this?
Excuse me, this means when we have, for example, an equilibrium, we will have more unemployment than if we...
Now let's see. Let's assume here this is the equilibrium prices that we want. This is the equilibrium prices. Let's say if the prices are on this level, okay. Now if they are in this level, there's a lot of big demand, right? People want to buy things, right? But the amount of supply is very, there's a big shortage here. So here you want to supply more because people are demanding. Now, if we have a lot of people want to buy things, then I am going to produce only little. Probably if I am in this position, I don't have jobs. So probably if I have full employment, some people will lose their jobs. So this will push it this way. Now, if it is pushed this way, people don't have jobs. Now, if they don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't spend. So we need to kind of push it, in this direction. Then we start to see people who are willing to do the jobs. Maybe we will start to see more pushing over here in order to increase the prices. Okay. So overall, we will start to see more higher prices.
This explains the two problems of macroeconomics. Below the E, you're going to get unemployment. Above the E, you're going to get inflation.
Yeah, maybe it's true. That's going to be like higher prices. But also, you'll get unemployment. Maybe here we'll get inflation. And it's not necessarily that, that if you are above, let's see, here you will get unemployment. You can also have an unemployment here also. But the prices will be high. So maybe this unemployment, going back to the same question. You see, so the relationship between those two can be maybe more complicated, but more complex. So there's a lot of things that can make this or make that. But in both cases, it's going to direct it towards E.
Higher prices not always means inflation.
Well, higher prices will be inflation.
Always.
Well, if they are, remember when we talked about the basket, and you start to see the prices are increasing, and then you need to calculate how much is the increase in prices. That is because of the increase of prices. So that's where you have inflation.
So, just coming back to that, for example, if we get a question of this, if the prices level is below than PE, what are the macro problems we would observe? And unemployment? Yeah,
we will start to have unemployment. Prices will be very cheap, right? And then we will start, those people, there are a number of consequences that will happen. But the ultimate goal will be to solve in order to reach to the equilibrium prices.
And deflation, can we consider it as a macro problem we would observe? I mean, within this low prices.
If prices are low,
I mean,
see, if prices are low, then a lot of people will be going and they want to buy, right? So this is going to drive prices up. And after it increases prices, then we're going to, it's going to be more expensive, so people will not be able to buy things. Here, they will buy less. And if prices increase, then people who are supply will produce more.
So we're talking about movement along the curve. We're not talking about shifting of the curve.
Yes. We're not talking about shifting.
And it's,
Shifting is another issue.
without an intention of the government. So it's the market.
It's market forces. Market forces. Now, government interventions, we said that's when the government starts to, put security, government put regulations, what you can do or you cannot do. Now, next, we've got this unstable outcomes, shifts. Now, here we're talking about the idea of shifts. Okay. Now, shifting in aggregate supply and aggregate demand, they can also upset a full employment equilibrium. Now, here we start to look at shifts. What happens if you have a leftward shift of the aggregate supply? Now, remember supply and demand, and then we've got the supply, and it will shift to the left. Do you see? Now, here will result in a higher prices levels and less output. Are you guys okay with this?
is this more
Very
supply?
similar. Let's do it here. Let's do this here. Here we've got this is supply and demand. Almost. This is the supply curve. And it will shift to the left. So here. Now, we were here. Prices will increase. And the quantity will decrease. So here we have less quantity. And here we will have higher price. Very similar to what we discussed in chapters 3 and 4. It's just on an aggregate level.
So the equilibrium is totally different right now.
Now here we will be on a new equilibrium. Okay. Now what happens if there is a left shift to the aggregate demand? So what happens if this is the demand and it shifts to the left? So we move from here to here. So here we've got in both cases lower prices, lower output. So here lower prices and less output. Are you guys okay with this? And then we've got this recurring shifts. Business cycle will result from recurrent shift of the aggregate supply and demand curves. Remember the business cycle? So it goes up and down. So that is going to affect, shifts to the right, to the left, and that is going to affect the equilibrium. Business cycles, alternating periods of economic growth and contraction. Shift factors. What will make the demand to shift? You guys remember shifting demand from the previous chapter?
Factors of,
Now here we've got this consumer sentiment. So what consumers believe overall, which is like similar to the taste and preferences. Taxes on consumer income. So like total taxes, the same as income. So if you give people tax cuts, then people have more income. If you increase your taxes, then and interest rates. So if interest rates increase, then maybe it is going to do it. Because remember, if interest rates increase, it's like another income. Because if interest rates are becoming very expensive, what do? You take your saving, instead of you buy a TV, no, you take it to the bank to invest. So people buy less. And if interest rates are very cheap, you know what? I will borrow money, I'll buy a new car.
What about the other factors?
Those are like the main. Now, from the supply and demand and micro, what other factors do you still have? Like technology and technology was a supply.
technology for suppliers.
Yeah, technology was supply. What was it?
Expectations and
Expectations. Yeah, maybe it will affect overall.
prices.
But these are like more, these are like more on an aggregate level, on a macro, on all products. Do you see? Because if you say expectations of what? Of TVs or cars or homes. Do you see? So this expectations can, it will go average out in the entire economy.
Expectation, maybe expectation of the business cycle.
Yeah, maybe that's true. Yeah, that makes sense. Do what? You want to take a break now? All right, maybe we take a break. Let's take a break and come back.